Okay, I think we've hit possible critical mass here. So I am talking about storylets. And this is a term that I've used a lot lately, but I wanted to check before I get sort of too deep into this. I have a lot of content in this talk. Not all of it is going to be appropriate depending on the answer to this question. So if you don't mind, since I saw a wide range of people on the sign-up sheet, what is it that brought you here? So is it you really wanted to come to an IF meetup, you have no idea what a storylet is, you figured you'd find out when you arrived? Okay, a couple. Cool. Welcome. Thanks for the faith, I appreciate it. How about these? Interested in doing something with them? Not sure yet. Okay, cool, reasonable number. You're writing things, actively using them, but you want to get more advanced with it.
I might be, but I don't know what they are.
Good answer. Okay, it is actually very possible that you are, okay? Any more a comment than a question type people? Maybe one or two. Nobody wants to own that. Okay. Good. All right. So it looks like there's a little bit of everything. But not. We won't dwell at too much length at what are we even talking about here. What do we mean by a storylet? So what I mean by a storylet is actually something quite broad. What I mean is when we are building a piece of interactive content, we have to have bits of story, bits of material that we're showing to the player in some order. So we have to have some kind of system for deciding what we're going to show them when. And a very standard way of doing that is the kind of Twine-style branching narrative. You've got a node. From that node, you can go to a couple of other nodes. But if you want to do something that is a little bit less committed to a particular structure, then you can create something that has the structure of a storylet. And what I mean by that is you have your piece of content. That content might be a piece of text. It might be some actual spoken dialogue in an audio experience. It might be an actual conversation in a AAA game. It might be something that's illustrated, all kinds of things, whatever kind of content that is. You have that piece of content, and then you have some prerequisites attached to it. So those might be, the prerequisites might be things like the player needs to use a certain number of inventory items to get access to this piece of content. They might need to have certain skills. They might need to have gotten some kind of preliminary progress points. However we're tracking that, there is a set of prerequisites on that content. And then there's also a set of effects that the content has on the world. And if you're thinking, well, that sounds relatively common and lots of things do something like that, yes. Many, many, many games are structured this way, even if people don't call them storylets or don't talk about storylets. So one of the reasons that I've been talking about storylets so much lately is that I've been using them a great deal in my own work, in work with Fallen London and Fail Better, where I'm now creative director, and we have some of my fine colleagues here, but also in a number of other projects that I've worked on recently. But I also keep having the experience of in consulting contexts, going into game studios and talking to them about what they're building and how their tool works. And they'll say, oh, we've got this thing where we've got events or nodes or, beats or whatever. They've got all of these different terms for them, but they mean this. And so one of the things that I'm finding is there's a lot of sort of scattered craft knowledge about how to design things with this kind of structure, how to use it, how to think about it, how to pace stories with it, but people are not talking to each other about that design structure very effectively. So part of my sort of mission here at the moment is just to kind of smooth out some of that lack of communication and let people kind of know what these things are. So I said a moment ago that the content in a piece like this could be itself more or less anything. So it could be something where you actually have some internal structure inside that content beat. You might have something that is structured as a bunch of storylets, but itself has some twine-like branching or something else within each of those chunks of story. You might have something that looks very game-like. Are people actually able to see this properly, or do the lights need adjusting? Is it okay?
Looks like a game thing.
Correct. Okay, good. This is actually a screenshot from Bruno Diaz's Voyager, which is a really cool game where you are descending through the cosmos. So you have this kind of spaceship, and the spaceship can only travel towards the center of the galaxy. So you can never go backwards. You can never return to anywhere you've ever been. And all of the locations that you can visit are these procedurally generated locations that have their own names, their own descriptions that are procedural text. They have the things to buy and sell. But each of these kind of moments are delivered in storylit beats. And then there are sort of plot moments that emerge that are delivered to you when you've kind of had enough experiences, when you've gotten the right prerequisites out of the way, you've met the right kinds of people, you've visited the right kinds of procedurally generated planets to unlock those plot beats. So this is a case where using the kind of storylit structure where those instances of plot are tied to a bunch of different abstract stats is letting you kind of find a story within a world where the world itself has been pretty procedurally constructed, which is one of the cool things that you can do with this. I would also argue that people tend not to think of things like Lily's Garden, these kind of casual games. This is a match 3 game, although I always flinch when people say that because I think I hate match 3 games, but I actually like this game, so therefore it must not be a match 3 game. And sometimes you're matching more than 3, which is why, that makes it much better. But what this is doing is it has beats of casual gameplay where you're playing the thing that is not match 3. And then when you do that, when you successfully clear a level, you get an opportunity to see another beat of story in Lily's life. And she's inherited this huge estate from her grandmother, from her aunt, that she needs to get back into good shape. And she's doing masses and masses of gardening, and it's all very impressive. And so each sort of the beats of the story of how she's getting to know her neighbors, how her love life is developing, how her annoying mother shows up, all of those things are unlocked by your sort of progress through the casual game. So you've got storylit beats of story and then sort of spacers of casual gameplay between them. And that works extremely well. So in general, you can imagine, as I was saying, a wide range of prerequisite types. So we might have a kind of Pride and Prejudice story where you've got a ballroom scene that you need to unlock by having enough muslin to make your dress. You need an invitation to an event that's properly hosted. You need it to be the right day of the season that you're playing through. You might need Mr. Darcy to like you a certain amount. There might be some risks associated with going. You might have a risk that the more Mr. Darcy likes you, the more likely it is that he'll propose to you, which will be very awkward. And then effects from that storylet. So you might have rewards that are given to the player. You might have progression that's moving them forward. And I'm going to come back and talk about kind of each of those kinds of structuring beats. Experience and skill stats. So you might have learned more about dancing by attending that storylet. So a lot of the things that we associate with kind of progress in other types of gameplay can be sort of put onto a storylet as mechanics. So you can construct something that really has quite a lot of sort of mechanical gameplay where you're making plans as a player, you're trying to achieve certain things, you're trying to increase stats. All of those things are things that you can do with storylets without any surrounding game architecture if you want. Or you can hook your storylets together with something that surrounds it. So that gives you a lot of kind of freedom in what you're doing with these pieces. And then another major decision that your game needs to make when you're sort of presenting players with something storylet based is who's actually making the decision about what beat they're experiencing next. Are we letting the game pick something? And so, for instance, Reigns, if you've played that, has kind of a pool of things that could happen next based on what's going on currently. And it selects one to present to you. And then you've got kind of a Tinder-style interface. So you've got a yes-no choice that the game is presenting to you that you can agree with or disagree with. And that choice then changes how much the various factions in the country that you're governing actually like you. So, as you might guess from the title Reigns, if you haven't played it, you are ruling this country, or you're one of a series of kings or queens ruling this country. And you've got the church, the people, the military, and then your treasury to worry about. And if any of those stats gets too high or too low, you're in trouble. And your character dies, and the next king is born, and then you're playing that king. So you're actually sort of cycling rapidly through kings as each of you, in turn, completely screws up your country. But so the sort of feeling that you get out of that, because both ends of the stat spectrum are so dangerous, you can't afford to have the church like you too much or too little. If you have too much money, you get crushed under the weight of your own gold. If you have too little, everybody starves. All of these kinds of things, you're really at this risk of falling off this tightrope. And on top of that, the game is serving you a series of events that you don't control. Like, there's some dependency on previous things that you've done in the narrative determining, oh, you met this character, you met this ambassador, you irritated the cardinal, whatever. And so those characters have additional story beats that they can introduce, storylets that they can bring you that are going to affect what you're allowed to do next. But you as a player have very little control over that. And so that creates an experience where you are kind of at the mercy of fate as the ruler of this kingdom, and your only hope kind of as of getting things into a better state is over the course of many dynasties coming to understand what's really going on in this kingdom, and then being able to have your last of many kings deal with the situation. So a very different kind of thing, kind of at the other end of the spectrum in terms of how much the player is allowed to control and manipulate and revise the experience that they're having with those storylets, is this game Below by Chris Gardner, which was built in Story Nexus, the system that's used by Fallen London as well. And this is a piece where the player is exploring a dungeon. They have a couple of different decks of storylets that they can draw from. So it's using a kind of card mechanic presentation. And you can, excuse me, you can choose to explore the dungeon by drawing another card from the Below deck. And that's going to give you a storylet that's based on what am I doing in this space, what monsters am I encountering, what spaces am I finding here. Or you can choose to draw from the Above deck. And the Above deck is not where you physically are, it's your memories of being on the surface. It's what you recall about living above. But the Above deck has the ability to cure the things that are ailing you. You feel better by thinking about what happened to you during your life, usually. And so that kind of offsets some of the difficulties that you're running into because of things in the Below deck. So a lot of the sort of elegance of this is that you as a player are doing some conscious deck building mechanics. You're making choices within the game to put additional things into the Above or the Below deck that are going to be advantageous to you. So it's making that kind of aspect of control really part of the experience of playing through the story. Okay, so that was a fair amount of information. Do people who did not know what a storylet was now think they know what I meant by it, or are there further questions?
I write musicals. A lot of the language you're using is alien to me anyway, so keep
Okay.
going, I'll get it.
So that's a no, but no questions.
I
Okay.
have one small question.
Sure.
Which is that you define them as having sort of inputs and then an effect.
Prerequisites and effects, yeah.
Prerequisites and
Yeah.
effects. Presumably it can still be a storylet if there are no effects. Or
Yes.
does that require-
Yes, so in the system, an individual storylet might have no effects. You might also, in theory, have a storylet where it was open-ended as to prerequisites, and it's just like, this is a default storylet that could fire at any time. Like, both of those things are possible. But to have an actual game system that is going to do something with agency and consequence, then you need at least some of the things in that pool to have prerequisites and effects. Yeah.
You keep referring to this in almost I'm going to use programming language here, a modular way, so that, say, procedurally generated or user input generated or whatnot, that these stand alone
Mm-hmm.
is kind of what I'm getting at. So I just want to make sure I'm on the right track with that.
Yes. So they are modular pieces That's sort of the design concept, is that you've got these modular pieces, that there are things that, there's sort of different strategies about how you might want to present them to the player that might make them feel not particularly modular. And sometimes you have cases where one storylet specifically links on to another one and says, go, next up is this one over here. So you can sort of create these mini sort of things more like a conventional branching narrative within the larger pool. Hi.
But they're not structurally, structure doesn't rely on them. They're not structural.
Well, there's implicit structure in those prerequisites. So I'm gonna talk a little bit in a moment about kind of how the numbers that you're attaching to these, like how the prerequisites and how the effects create a structure, right? But the individual pieces, the idea is we could draw something from this pool, and it would have a structural effect. Okay, so here's my, I don't know if you're going to be able to see it from back there, but my sort of show and tell piece for this. Here I have a storylet, okay? The introduction storylet. And on this side it says what the prerequisite is, which is that I've got some sort of progress number, some sort of progress stat, and the progress stat is currently at 1. And then an effect of the introduction storylet is that it increments that stat. So after we've played the introduction storylet, progress is now at 2, right? And then I have this storylet, and this storylet is the hi, how are you stat, or storylet. Its prerequisite is that progress is 2, and then it's going to ask you how you are. If you say, I'm happy, happy face. Ooh, look, I can put light on the paper. If I do that, then I get progress plus 1, so progress is going to go up to 3, and I've also tracked the mood, so I've got mood plus 1. If it's plain face, progress is 1. If it's unhappy face, progress plus 1, and mood minus 1. Right, so we're tracking all of these different things in consequence. So there's, just by having this progress stat, there's an implied structure, right? This storylet has to happen before this storylet because we don't have any other storylets that can transition from one to the other. Does that make sense? So if, on the other hand, I had a bunch more progress equals 1, progress plus plus storylets, then I can have any of these. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions on that? Cool. Okay. So the next thing that we want to tackle, given all of that, is supposing that we've decided that storylets are interesting to use, how might we do that? So before I even sort of launch into the how, I want to give a little additional kind of explanation on why. Because what I was just describing was, very sort of, this is what they are, here's how they theoretically work, here are several games that they plug into. The why you might do this kind of thing is that organizing your content in this fashion makes it really expandable and really possible to interconnect pieces that are written by different people at different times. So if you have a system where you're building a story where you want to create the beginning form of that story now, and then you want other writers to be able to contribute events that can happen in your story, if you want to allow players to create mods that contribute events to your story, if you want to do something now and then you want to come back later and do some DLC that fundamentally interacts with your story in an interesting way, all of those things are things that storylets give you a bit more structural leverage on than if you were building it as a more sort of static structure. There's also just tremendous freedom to kind of expand on and play with what you're doing. And so the sort of basic underlying idea of a storylet as some content with some prerequisites attached, you could argue that's even used for things like delivering dialogue beats in Left 4 Dead or in Firewatch. You could describe that way, because what they're doing is saying, I've got all of these pieces of dialogue, I'm going to watch the world state until the moment when the player isn't trapped in a room with a bunch of zombies, When that happens, I'm then going to look at my pool of available materials. It's doing a little bit of extra interesting stuff. So there's a cool GDC talk about how this works. But the basic idea of I have a pool of material that I can draw on at the right moment based on what's going on in the game world and fire that off. It's very useful to have modularized this way. Okay, so sermon on why. First thing you're probably going to ask is, if you're doing this by yourself, what do you do it in? So, like, the ideal situation, obviously, is, well, maybe not obviously. I had a professor in grad school who said, every time you start a sentence with obviously, it's because you're trying to get away with something. And I've just, like, failed to learn that lesson still, so apologies. It is a lovely thing to be in a situation where either you are yourself a confident engineer and can whip up prototypes of whatever you like, or you happen to work for a studio in a position where you can ask/tell somebody else to whip up whatever you like. Those are both delightful positions of privilege to be in. Not everybody is in those positions. So, if you are at the sort of less technical end, but you still really want to play with the concept, there is a sort of variation of Twine with some extra features that somebody named Josh Grams has been working on. That's its GitHub information. I'm intentionally leaving this slide up a little extra long in case anybody wants to photograph it or anything like that. And that allows you to take a sort of standard Twine and do some extra things with it that give you a node structure that you can play with, that give you some opportunity to do some tagging. If you're kind of one step up from that and you're comfortable with Unity, and this is something that I've seen done a lot in indie games and like different projects that I've seen that are intended for commercial sale, also in some projects that are not, it's possible to put together a pretty nice storylit system using Ink and Unity or using Yarn and Unity. So Ink or Yarn are both going to give you the ability to do some branching bits, to do some marked up text, to do some elements that might be the textual content of your storylit beats. And then the surrounding Unity would control how does your game world interface control access to those things? How is the game going to decide to ask a question of this system? So you might, in Unity, put something together that says, hey, when I've got this map in Unity, when I'm in this particular location on the map, I'm then going to set some tags that say what the location is, and those tags are going to restrict what part of my storylit pool I'm looking at to serve content to the player. So there's lots of sort of robust and interesting stuff you can do that way. If you are at the more sort of, I either have a lot of time and coding ability, or I actually want to build something brand new for a new system, maybe at a studio, maybe just as a massive hobby project. I also have some notes about kind of what are the design considerations if you're building a tool for this from scratch? Like what is it? What does it involve building this kind of thing? So pick your spot on that if you want to start building something. Anybody else need this slide for a second longer, or are we done? Yeah.
Question? The reason you wouldn't use regular Twine
Yes.
for this is because you want to have the facility to pick out of a kind of a pool of like random events.
Yeah.
Which is almost like a board game. You have a pile, but except that what you want your system to do is to resort that in response to what you've done so far.
Yes. And it's potentially applying a bunch of restrictions to that pile. After you've selected something, it's potentially making a bunch of variable changes. So traditional Twine expects you to explicitly link on to what's coming next. So you'd have to do a bunch of work to tell it how to randomize or how to pick options among available other storylets. So that would be a lot of effort. So this system helps with that kind of stuff. Yeah.
What about analog tools? I was immediately attracted to your yellow sheet of paper, which
Yes. We're going to be, see, I have lots of sheets of paper. So we're going to be doing more with that. basically, I do a fair amount of paper prototyping at the very, very beginning of this process. Like, as soon as you really seriously get into doing wacky things with the stats, and you're manipulating a lot of elements, then I start to need to use the digital interface. Sorry. I really should have brought myself a glass of water. I'm sorry about that. But basically, what I do with that is essentially this kind of thing. Usually I'm using an index card because that's more convenient if I'm not holding it up at the front of a room. But put, what are the prerequisites? What are the effects? What is the basic story beat that I'm talking about here? And kind of make myself a little pile and be the computer for a bit and kind of play through it and keep a track and a kind of scorecard of what are the stats currently. And that can be very helpful in first of all, just figuring out what your stats even need to be. Second of all, getting kind of a sense of the flow of the narrative that you're getting that way. And then if you've got a system that's sufficiently simple, you actually could, run that as a paper game. Or you can use it as a design basis for what you're doing next.
I think there are a lot of narrative board games these days that essentially are using a story-led system, and you have like a deck of cards or something like that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I mean, they are often not, well, in the ones that I've looked at, they're often not going quite as deep into the range of stats you could think of. But yeah, I mean, at the like stat light end, it's definitely potentially a board game system. Anything else? Yeah.
At the risk of being too nitty-gritty, I use Cradle, so I put Twine into Unity.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something specific? I've looked at Ink, but I haven't looked at it a lot. Is there something specific to follow on from the other question?
Right.
That you could tell me about what Ink in Unity can do differently to Twine in Unity if you're able to. Is there something in Ink authoring that allows that
Right.
customization?
I think if you're comfortable with Twine and you're comfortable with the Twine to Unity interface, then you may well be able to do what you want with that. But do it in Unity.
Yeah.
I haven't, on projects that I've worked on myself, I haven't seen people doing that. But that's not to say it's unworkable. I think there are a couple of nice things about Ink for, especially if you're doing a large project, and story-lit projects can become very large. One is that it is relatively compact, often compared with Twine, in terms of just kind of reading through and revising because you've got the text presented as text. It's friendly for version control. There's a bunch of stuff like that that makes it realistic for, kind of commercial work. And it also is reasonably friendly about how it handles inline variable replacements and things like that. Not that you can't do that with Twine, obviously, but so if you're happy with that, then that's.
No, but version control is a good reason.
Yeah.
Okay.
Other questions? Yeah.
So just on Ink quickly, I do think the main selling point of Ink is that it's designed to be integrated with
Yeah.
things like Unity, and
Yeah.
that just goes fairly smoothly. I wanted to ask, as well as tools for implementing this, what about tools for like visualizing these structures, right? You've got these cloud of stories.
Yes,
You've got
yes.
some handcrafted little change you put in there, like your example with the
Right.
cards there. How do we?
Yes. Okay. You are anticipating later in the talk. So we'll get to. I'll get to charts later. Okay. Actually wanted to start now by doing a little bit of sort of hands-on exercise. When I originally envisioned this, I thought we would have like 10 or 15 people, and it would be more plausible to do this as a small group activity. So that's not going to work. But where I often start is by thinking about what are some things, like suppose I've got a setting, I've got my premise, I've got my sort of the game world that I'm building for. What are some cool things that I want to be part of my story? And think about it in terms of those individual beats that might be occurring in the course of the story. Does anybody else also like to write things? Does anybody want to be a scribe?
Yeah, go on.
Cool. Thank you. All right. So when we give you a story beat, write in big letters what it is in the middle, and then we can worry about what the stats will be later. Okay? We should start by selecting some kind of setting or premise to work with. Anybody got something on their mind that they would like to collaboratively write a story-like game about?
As long as you've been kind enough, game poker.
Okay, poker. Are we thinking of a context for playing poker in?
I guess I'm thinking of a story that takes place over the course of a game of poker, wherein things happen to you and your luck and your interaction with other players, and
Okay.
comes to some resolution. You win, you lose, you get shot. I don't know.
Okay, so this takes place in the land of guns.
Poker usually does.
Oh. All right. So is it like full on Old West? Are we on a steamboat? Is it like more recent? We're in Vegas. Sorry?
It's in Vegas, and it's like a 48-hour period when none people go outside, and they don't know like whether it's night or day or anything like that.
Okay, so it's some sort of poker. It's like an actual tournament.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the venue's on fire.
The venue's on fire. Okay, I think we now have enough information to get rolling. The venue's on fire, and nobody cares because they're trying to win a 48-hour poker tournament.
Wait, get out of the venue as you win.
Okay, and you're not allowed out until winning. Okay, I mean, it paints a picture. I feel like we're on something here. Okay, so in this context, what are some things that are going to happen in the course of this story?
Everyone's gonna get hot.
Sorry?
Everyone's gonna get hot.
Okay, heat. It's too hot.
Someone's going to cheat or get caught cheating.
Maybe we need 2 writers.
Left, right.
Yes, I'm trying to. There we go. There we go. Thanks. All right, cheating. Someone who's caught cheating. All right, what else?
Doesn't the fire have to start in the first place?
It does. Fire starts.
It's just a bit dry.
Hmm.
I think it's because it was broken.
Oh, okay. I just bought them. Other things. Somebody got shot, apparently.
Yeah, the sprinklers go up.
Sprinklers go off? He seems to be getting all of the fire-related ones.
There must be variations of drunkenness, surely.
All right. Somebody gets drunk.
A romance between 2 players.
Romance.
The horse is at the table.
I'm sorry, did you say a horse?
Yeah.
It's revealed one of the players deliberately started the fire.
Okay. All right, who has deliberately started the fire?
I get that.
Do you have the horse? Okay.
They're actually all dogs
It's actually
trying to
a love
recreate
triangle.
Oh, it's a love triangle. Okay.
The horse in it.
Love triangle.
Love triangle.
People placing hands of poker.
What a weird suggestion.
Someone gets a really, really
Hands of
bad
poker?
beat.
Somebody gets a really, really bad heat.
Bad beat, like somebody who has a really great hand loses through incredibly bad luck unexpectedly.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
This is using poker terminology with which I am not familiar, but I'll take your word for it. Okay. What else?
Great bluff.
Ah, okay.
Right.
Someone bets their wedding ring and loses.
Oh.
Someone bets a fire extinguisher.
Bet's a fire extinguisher. Okay.
Should I write both of them down?
He's getting wedding ring.
Wedding ring. Okay.
Yeah.
The police turn up and everyone has to pretend that there's not a shady like whatever poker tournament going on.
Someone realizes they got the wrong ticket and they weren't supposed to be there in the first place.
Are you doing the police?
Yeah.
Okay. Somebody has the wrong ticket. They're not supposed to be there.
Somebody's taken really ill. Quite dramatic.
Someone either wins or the
Right. Okay. All right. Somebody's taken ill. Somebody wins.
Someone turns up late and still plays.
Okay, so somebody joins the game late. Interesting. Okay.
Late comer.
Yeah.
Somebody tries to make a break for it despite not having won.
Through the fire.
Like running out the door.
mean,
Why?
it's a fight,
I
right?
have a question about the premise. Like, what is keeping everybody in their seats?
I mean, I would have thought the poker game is inherently the fight.
The amount of money.
Right.
If
Okay.
you
So.
lose, you can choose if you flee or if you rebuy because you really want the money. Also, glue.
Okay. Yes. All right. So we've got. Hypothetically, somebody is glued to their seats. I'm not sure how that's going to play into things, but possibly. Anything else?
A dealer makes a mistake at a critical moment.
Okay.
Taking that back.
Dealer mistake.
Mistakes catch fire.
Everybody dies.
Stakes catch fire.
It's a bit of a metaphor for climate crisis, isn't it? It's really striking.
Oh goodness.
Yeah, I thought we were going to have a restful evening.
Two players recognise each other from Gamblers Anonymous.
Oh, okay. Players from Gamblers Anonymous recognize each other.
Gamblers.
There's a hidden message on the back of one of the cards.
Hidden message on a card.
The news crews chose us and starts broadcasting it live.
Everybody is very attracted to this location that is going to burn them to crisps. Okay, I think on the evidence, we could continue with more and more ludicrous possibilities all evening, but I think we have enough to work with here. So, thank you for your scribe efforts. Excellent. Okay, so there's a lot of implicit sort of state information already going on in these, and we are not going to do the entire pack right now, but just kind of as an example. Some of these things are things that are about the poker game itself. Some of them are things that are about the progress of the fire. Some of them are about relationships between players. Some of them are... It's hard to even know what the hidden message on the back of the card is for or about, but I guess we'll find out later. So, if we were going to take something like an example story beat, and think about what does this suggest to us about the underlying structure of our game world? When can the dealer make a mistake? What has to be true before the dealer makes a mistake? Sorry?
You're playing a hand.
You're playing a hand, okay. What else?
The dealer
Dealer's
is
got to
dead.
be a character of the story.
Right, dealer exists.
Everybody knows they're a dealer. Well, you know, I mean, it's not. It has to be clear, doesn't it?
It's not dead. And the social role of the dealer is accepted as such. Okay.
Do players need to be aware that the dealer has made a mistake?
Maybe, maybe not. That's a decision that we might make that decision kind of later in determining, like, what is the content of this content, what is the sort of presentation of that content, how are we telling the player about it. So there are a lot of interesting things we might do with this. We might have this be an event that is narrated explicitly and we see the dealer making a mistake. We might have it be something where the dealer makes a mistake, but that's actually not narrated, but we just make the effects true. So there are sort of interesting different things we might do with that. How about somebody wins? What has to be true before somebody wins?
They have to still be playing.
Okay. So the somebody in question needs to be playing.
Did they catch on fire?
Okay, so we're going to have player is not dead.
There's a reward to win.
Player is playing. Yes.
For it to be significant, would you not want the reward to be reasonably high? Wouldn't there be like a point at which it becomes an interesting story event? Because if it's so low, it wouldn't affect it.
Yes, that is an interesting point. So you are drawing in some rules of poker about like how big are the stakes currently, and looking at how do how do we combine those with the dramatic import of this beat, right? So maybe the effect of this storylet is it's going to give you a reward, and the reward is not the same reward all the time. The reward is equal to the amount of the stakes on the table, right?
But there's fundamental variables that are running through that's going to affect all of these. This one is the players want all the chips.
Yes.
The fire hasn't progressed too far, so the progression of the fire,
Mm-hmm.
the number of chips that the players have are going to be very significant in determining whether or not the storylet plays out.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, part of what we're doing here is kind of exposing what some of those stats are. Some of them are just implicit in what poker is as a game. By basing this on another game, we've kind of given ourselves a little bit of that information to start with. Police show up, and we have to pretend there is no game. What is prerequisite for that?
Assuming there needs to be a game, otherwise...
Yeah, the game needs to have started.
Doors aren't locked.
Game has started.
I mean, the fire can't be too obvious.
Fire hasn't happened yet.
Okay, and then fire progression is less than something.
Less than attention they would pay to the game. Like they have, for us to care about whether or not they discover the game,
Right.
they have to not arrive and go, oh my god.
Right, okay. This one is interesting to me because this implies that the storylet could come out in different ways, right? Like, it's not obvious to me what the effect of this is. Do they find out or do they not find out? It sounds to me like this is going to branch. Yeah? So if they do find out, then what happens?
Fire starts.
So we get a dramatic save in that moment. Okay.
So when you have multiple ways this could sort of resolve, do you think of those as different versions of this storylet, or the same one with kind of branching inside it?
Same one with branching inside it, typically. So that's like, at some point, we're inviting the player to make an explicit choice or to do something in the gameplay or something, and that's going to determine how does this resolve. So if they do find out the fire starts, that's interesting because it's not actually, there's no real causal relation there. There's a dramatic relation, right?
If
Which
they
is...
do find out they set the fire.
Somebody might set the fire
Someone sets the fire, okay.
because they found out.
Okay. If they don't find out, then they go away again, or what happens?
They join the game.
Wait, so they can't join a game if they didn't find out it's going on.
But they go away again, but they don't come anymore.
Okay, so the...
Opposite the other way around. They keep coming back until eventually they find out. and
Right.
set the fire.
Okay. So we've sort of created a sense of ongoing risk. So what we're going to do is we're going to say that the police are going to come back, in half an hour's time. Okay. So the police are dispelled for now, but we've got a cyclical thing going on here until the police are dealt with. All right. How about somebody betting their wedding ring and losing?
Someone's chips are down far enough that they might plausibly need to.
Mm-hmm.
They're married.
Is that what chips are
Somebody
down?
married.
I'm literally down like a low file. Is that what that means? Wow. So many things.
There must be a great reward to take that risk.
It's not chips.
Pretty sure that's one of the Gamblers Anonymous people.
Oh, okay. Do we want to make that a prerequisite, that this only works for a Gamblers Anonymous person? Okay.
Might you have this be a different person depending on who's been established previously?
You might, and that gets into another fun thing about storylets, which is that some systems, not all, but some systems allow you to attach the storylets and actually sort of cast them, right, in the moment. So you might, instead of having a storylet that says, Bob stakes his wedding ring, Bob is always the jerk in this situation, it's any character who has these features can stake their wedding ring, but that could be anybody in this story. And then the storylet needs to know, okay, once I've matched that prerequisite and I've figured out who that character is, I've grounded this storylet to a particular character, I'm not going to remember that, and I'm going to use that character's name in the description, I'm going to use that character in effect. If something happens as a result of the storylet, I'm going to apply the effects to that character. So you need to be able to do all of the rest of that. there's some very interesting work. So this gets into an area that's less explored. So not all tools allow for that, like that kind of dynamic casting of storylets. Not every tool out there will do that. However, there is some really cool academic work around it by Max Kreminsky, which is using some kind of Prolog-like language tools to find things that are going to fit in really complex situations. So not just, is this like pick a random person who's in Gamblers Anonymous, but might be something like, let's look at the situation and see if a love triangle exists, and if so, who the participants in the love triangle are, and slot them all into the storylet in appropriate roles. So this might be something that introduces casting. This is great because you are discovering for yourselves many of the things that I thought I was going to have to explain, which is super cool. Okay, so we've had a lot of poker things. We need a couple of fire things, and then we can move on from this moment. So fire starts. Does this need any prerequisites?
The police have discovered the poker.
Well, it could happen as a result of the police discovering the poker game, yeah. So we could actually link directly from the police thing.
So do you tend to focus on like the sort of logical prerequisites, or would you be a bit more, would you think about pacing and say, oh, I don't want this to happen until we
I absolutely would think about pacing. So another thing, what I was actually expecting...
As the tutorial or something.
Yes. So it might be... Okay, so we might do something where here's everybody starts to feel hot. Maybe we actually want everybody starts to feel hot before they notice there's a fire, right? So we've got the alarming buildup, and then we've got... Well, actually, the fire has actually started up here, but we don't know about it until down here, right? So there are things like that. So sometimes you want to gate storylets depending on what does the player know. So the tutorial case, cases of, the player hasn't found this fact out yet, therefore we're not going to kind of build on the fact. So sometimes storylets do things like that. When I use storylets to represent dialogue specifically, I often have dialogue storylets dependent on what is the player's knowledge, what is the knowledge of the other characters in the scene, and then that can say like, oh, we've already talked about the police and about Gamblers Anonymous, and that's going to unlock this other follow-up line, and that allows you to remix the elements of the dialogue in a very cool way. So that's something I've done on a few past projects. But you can also do things where you're much more explicitly modeling dramatic tension. Like I've also done things where there's an explicit buildup where one of the sort of stats that you're watching is, how much peril is this person in, or how many times have they tried to get their goal. This can be a fun one for sort of dramatic buildup. Like you've got a character who's the protagonist of your story. They really want to accomplish something. They've tried things. How many times have they failed to reach their goal previously? The more they failed, the more we unlock more and more exaggerated things for them to do to try and get to that point. So there are various kinds of models that you can use, also with stats, but with these numbers representing different kinds of issues. Okay, so let's stop there for a sec, but I think that gives a good idea of when you start thinking about these moments, there is kind of implied behind all of those moments a bunch of rules that you are going to want to apply to your story. And what I often do is go through and think about what are those rules. Some of them I know coming in, right? Like your case of we know that we're going to need to model how many chips people have. We know we're going to need to model, who's currently in the round or not. Like those things are kind of, if we're doing a realistic poker story, we're going to need all of that information. We can guess that from the outset. If I were doing a less realistic poker story, I might actually not model the poker game as precisely, but I might instead make it be about how kind of invested are people in this round, and think about it a little bit differently. But then as we think about those beats, we find certain recurring things, like characters being in danger, characters thinking they're going to win or lose, things about the progress of the fire. Like those things are coming out in a lot of our story beats. And then there are some other things where we might actually wind up not bothering to model them because they wind up being something where, if there's some sort of element in here that is always true, like say that there was a prerequisite on the dealer making a mistake that said a prerequisite of the dealer making a mistake is that the players all know who the dealer is. Well, if there's no point in the game where the dealer is always the same dealer throughout no matter what, then we don't need to model that because it's never going to change. It's going to be true from the outset. It's going to stay true the whole game. We just not bother to put that in the model at all because it's always true. So there are some things that we eliminate at that end. And then there are other things where we might say, oh, we've got this sort of cool, interesting thing about these characters in Gamblers Anonymous, but that only comes up in sort of 2 of our 150 storylets. Do we actually want to commit to that and build it out, or do we want to say, it's kind of like a flavor thing and we're not going to do that much with it? Yeah.
For something like Heat, you were speaking earlier about setting things up so that came before the awareness of the fire.
Yeah.
And it being a very deliberate storyline. Is that also something, assuming that storylets have got visibility of the state of the game,
Yep.
that you might kind of bring in as decoration to the text without it being a storylet in itself?
Yeah.
Just like, Heat is 6, therefore kind of have this line in the content.
Yes, yeah. So we were talking about storylet casting earlier and being able to actually tie the storylet to particular people or particular entities in the game world. A less extreme thing that is done sort of in more storylet systems that I know of is to have the ability to have text within a storylet be based somehow on the values of numbers somewhere else in the world. So you can say, like, I've got this line that is going to be my line about how hot it is in here, and every time I tell you about how hot it is, I'm going to increment some number, and we're just going to have a progressive thing that keeps coming up. And so there's just, for the first 5 storylets, there's nothing about the fire at all. We're just doing a poker game, but there's a progressive set of references to that. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay. That's what we did there. Yay! Okay. So, talking about a few different sort of styles of stat that emerge. So progress stats, a progress quality or progress stat is tracking the main kind of narrative arc. How far are we through this story, right? Like, maybe progress 1 in these little pieces is we're having an introduction and now we're telling each other how we are, and it's a very linear kind of one at a time thing. Maybe in our exciting fire story, we want progress number 1 to be we arrive at the hotel, or we foolishly sign up to be in this poker tournament, or whatever that is. Maybe we decide, maybe as a player, we're actually deciding which of the characters at the table we're going to be playing. So we kind of capture those introductory pieces, and then we can drive those progress stats forward as we go through the story and, sort of represent what's the middle of this story, what's the end of the story. If you've got a really large game world, you might have something where there's a long kind of narrative arc that's happening in the main, over the course of this long game, and then you might have some mini plots within that, some, side quests, some episodic elements, whatever that is, where those are kind of self-contained little stories, and they have their own progress stats that only apply to that particular story. So if we, for instance, we were dividing up the poker game, we might have something where the whole narrative arc here is, beginning, we arrive at this tournament, we play a little bit of poker. One hand might be this kind of episodic thing, right? And we're tracking over the course of playing the hand, how far are we through, have we turned in our cards yet? The little amount of poker terminology I know is just left completely. There's something about a river, and that's not the same as draw poker, and I don't know. So anyway, has a turning point poker event occurred? Yes or no? Is the poker event over? Yes or no? Okay, and then that's kind of the episode. And then that might be over in ways that are affecting kind of the rest of the game world, but the main narrative arc continues. Maybe we do another hand of poker that's higher stakes. It's got its own, progression. We get to the end game where everybody is escaping or not escaping from the fire, and so on. Does the storylet system itself have to do all of this work? Not necessarily. Sometimes the surrounding game world provides that for you, right? In 80 days, you've got a map. You move over the course of the map. The map is your progress, and in fact, your sort of branching narrative representation. So you've got little story beats that are associated with particular places, but it doesn't have to have quite the same kind of tracking of narrative arc structure in the same way. Although it does have your countdown of how many days it's been, so that's another kind of progress metric. So secondary stats, besides your sort of progression stat, there's all this other information that we want to track, which might be things like skill, might be things like sort of traits or characteristics of the character. You know, are they in Gamblers Anonymous? Are they married? We were talking about somebody staking a wedding ring. Are they doing more or less poorly? How many chips do they have? So all of those things can be tracked either, you know, belonging to particular characters or just as sort of free-floating facts about the game world. We also might want to track kind of resources. This gets into very conventional inventory and gameplay features. So things that might be trade goods, things that you might take with you on a quest, props that you might use in the course of a more story-based game. All those are things that you might acquire, and that might then unlock particular storylets. So maybe in this game, our resources are the cards that we're holding, and we might have a good hand or a bad hand, depending on exactly what we've picked up. And if we've bribed the dealer appropriately, we might have 5 aces and have to figure out how to explain that to people. So there are sort of things that we can do with that. And the poker chips themselves, of course, are a form of resource, which can be high or low, in good state or bad state. And then we can also do those intangible resources. We can track things and represent them in the story world that might be energy, hit points, favors people owe us. How many times have I insulted this guy? There's a project that I worked on almost 10 years ago now, sadly, where we had a mechanic that I was super excited about, where if somebody had insulted you in the past, you could use that past insult to get social leverage to get them to be nice to you in the future. And that resource, like, was going to kind of get you through different sort of awkward social situations. It was mostly a kind of a comedy piece. It sadly never came to be, but the point is you can have things like that which represent kind of abstract elements of what the player's experience has been previously that can lock or unlock previous bits. I've also made it sound from that description as though that game was just about being mean to people all the time. It wasn't. It was just like, you know, that was a memorable thing about it. So speaking of insults and bad things happening to you, there's a term that's used a lot at Fail Better, but I think is a very good one for this kind of concept, is the idea of menaces. So a menace is a stat that builds up that you don't want to be increasing. So instead of having hit points that are falling, you might have, you know, how far along is this fire, right? And the fire starts out as, you know, barely noticeable, but it's getting hot in here to, you know, we're all gonna die over the course of time. And you can do interesting things with menaces as well to unlock pieces of the story and say, okay, this is, you know, these pieces of this story become available. The piece where we all flee the poker table, even though we haven't won, but it's just so bad in here that we finally have overcome our greed and we're more concerned about our lives, but that only unlocks near the end game. That might happen. We might have something where, you know, the menace is, I don't want people to know who I really am. There's a kind of implicit thing of that in Gamblers Anonymous. Are people starting to suspect me? That might be a menace. And those menaces might unlock additional sort of side branches to the story. They might trigger off results that I don't want to experience that are sort of mandatory storylets. So another mechanic that we haven't really talked about so far, but that is interesting to think about, is the idea of a mandatory storylet where the player is not getting to pick, but the game world circumstances have reached such a point that that storylet is going to fire off, right? The fire has gotten so out of control, the dealer's made such a bad mistake that we've got to have a story that's going to deal with it. And so we're bringing that kind of narrative situation to the front for the player. The other nice thing about menaces is that you can also create storylets that allow you to deal with and dispel the menace. So you might have some things where, you know, I'm trying to think of poker-based examples, and again, I'm at a loss here. But okay. So suppose I want the other people at the poker table to think I'm not very good at poker. I could do this easily, but suppose it's difficult for me. I want them to think I'm not very good at poker, and so I'm going to throw the first hand and play it extremely poorly in order to lower their distrust and fear of me menace, so that the next hand, they will not be expecting me to do anything awesome, and I will be able to swoop in and be scary to them. Okay, so given all of those kind of things that we can move around, all of those elements, we can use them as prerequisites, we can use them as effects on our storylets, and we can build a lot of really interesting features out of that, structures out of it. Why is this not advancing? There we go. Okay, so some of the things that we can build wind up looking quite a lot like a conventional Twine thing. So a lot of the things that are conventional choose your own adventure or Twine-style structures are things that you could build with storylets also if you wanted to, right? Like you can build this kind of structure by having a 1, 2, 3 kind of progress mechanic, and then having a couple of menace stats, and every time your menace stat happens, you automatically die. And then you've got a kind of classic linear gauntlet story where if the player makes any mistakes, the game is over, and they have to get everything right to get to the end. And it's a bit cruel, but that was the way it was in the 80s when I was little. Or you can do things that are more like a kind of branch and bottleneck, a sort of choice of games, or some more modern choose your own adventure kinds of things, where you make some mid-game choices, and those change some of your secondary stats. So you've got your progress stats marching along, but you also got your secondary stats saying, oh, okay, like I did the introduction, I did how are you, I made one of 3 choices, they set the mood, and then I've got one storylet that corresponds to we're in a good mood, one storylet that corresponds to we're in a neutral mood, and one storylet that corresponds to we're in a bad mood. We go on to a next beat, but at some point, when the progress is high enough, we're going to bring everything back, and everybody, regardless of their mood, is going to have some shared next progress beat. So you can kind of accomplish those kinds of things. You can even do a time cave if you want to. One, I'm not sure you should want to. But 2, the time cave is probably the least good fit for storylets because you have to do loads and loads of tracking to accomplish this, right? Like the bigger that gets, the more you have to do with sort of different individual qualities, and it's really a pain. It's not really what this kind of system is for. You can do it. If you really want to build something like that, just use Twine. It's gonna it's gonna be big and a horrible structure, and but yes. Anyway. All right. So there also are cool cyclical patterns. So things where there's a story where certain elements of it recur on a certain timeline. Like we've got winter, spring, summer, and fall events. We've got holidays that occur at particular times. And so we can have storylets that are associated with, is it currently winter? Is it currently spring? Is it currently summer? Is it currently fall? And the player who's playing through these might sort of constantly have their time of year stat advance. But that means that at some point they're going to come back around to their sort of second round through winter and so on. And that can be really fun from a storytelling point of view because it means that we can have the player kind of already has seen some of the stories in this, or storylets in this pool of events. They may not have seen all of them. We might have some that are only unlocked on our second or third or fifth time through this loop. But the fact that it's partly familiar ground and partly unfamiliar ground means that the player can actually build some anticipation and some sense of agency around what they're going to do when it's winter again, which can be quite cool. In the sort of poker game, that could be something where if we were really rigidly structuring this, like if we wanted to say, okay, like during this game, this overall game, you're only ever at the poker table, it's all about sitting there playing one hand after another of poker, then you could actually make that as a loop cycle where it's where are you through your current hand, and then I'm starting another one and I'm in a new place, but there's a really kind of consistent mechanic and beat to that. So your progress quality governs the shape of the story that you're in. It doesn't necessarily mean that the player is stuck inside this particular story. So if you have a sort of an episode, let's not say it's one of the hands in the poker game because you probably shouldn't leave the table during your poker game, but you might have some sort of other episodic thing that's happening. Maybe, I mean, we're talking about some romance elements. So what if, maybe one of our sort of episodic bits of progression inside this story is that we're developing a little romance with one of the other players, and that's got its own progress. And the elements, those storylets, those interactions of me talking to that player, me interacting with that player, those can be interspersed with the hand that we're currently in. So we can have sort of two different narratives happening side by side. And we can kind of visualize different ways that we might play through that experience that might sort of order the storylets that are actually experienced by the player in a particular way. Okay, so we've done a little bit on kind of what our actual stats might be for this. If we actually, let me do it this way. I'm gonna hand around the cards that we currently have. So, instructions-ish. These are not super mandatory, but if we're gonna do the next bit, then we need to have at least something that corresponds. So let's declare that we have a couple of stats that are going to exist in our game. We're going to have an overall progress, and the overall progress is going to be defined as if it's 1, then the game has not started. 2, 3, 4 is, the game has started, we've played the first hand, second hand, third hand, and then this is the end of the game. Okay? We're also going to have so this is the game progress. Let's call it just game progress. Then we got fire progress. Oh no. Here things are definitely burning a lot. And then we're going to have a side stat, which is the player's wealth. And let's say that ranges from 0 to 100. So you can maximally have 100 chips, whatever that means. Is that enough? I think we want one more weird thing.
Trust, distrust.
Trust at the table in general?
Yeah, like if you're able to bluff your way through.
Cool. Okay, is that going to be kind of how? Yeah, let's just call it trust at the table in general, and let's make tournaments 1 to 5, fires 1 to 5, players' wealth is 1 to 100 because we want something a little more granular, and then trust level is 1 to 5, with 5 being we all love each other here and are as brethren,
Like
and
wealth,
1 being
not health. Wealth or health?
wealth.
Wealth.
Your health is either you're well or you're a crisp. Okay. So confining yourselves to these stats, because we're not going to be able to do anything with any other stats, work out what you think the prerequisite should be and what you think the effect should be on a couple of those things. All right, so let's now run through this. Hooray! Hooray! Okay, so I have handed out most of the cards. The deal is, if you're holding one, if your effects are true, so the stats are lined up with what your storylet needs, raise your hand. We'll find out what's currently available. As an audience, we'll pick whose event we want to fire. We'll apply the results. We'll see what happens next. This is going to be a total mess. That's fine. Okay, so we are starting with progress at 1, fire at 1, side stat of player's wealth at 50. I'm deciding arbitrarily because you can't start a poker game with no money at all. And trust level at 3. Okay. So, I think there are not actually very many progress at 1 cards. Does anybody think they have one? Yes. Can it fire?
Yeah.
Yeah, what is it?
It's literally just fire.
Okay, so we have the opportunity to jump the gun and start the fire right now if we want to. Other things that are currently available are a newcomer joins the tournament, or a romance begins. This requires that we have at least 3 players in the game, but let's assume that we do. And it suggests that there's a menace of jealousy. So that's not one of the stats that we're currently tracking, but that might come into play. So, do we want a newcomer joins? Do we want romance? Or do we want the fire breaks out immediately?
Oh, I also have a bad beat.
Oh, you also have bad beat?
Yeah, but that can be played anytime.
I thought
Okay.
the game hasn't
As
started
long
yet.
as it's not turn-
The prerequisites might have been miswritten. That's the thing that happens.
Can we have both at the same time and have a stranger joining and some love at first sight?
You could, in theory, depending on how your storylit system was set up, but most storylit systems are going to select or allow the player to select one option.
I'd say start the fire.
We want to start the fire right now.
No, I think in great storytelling tradition, a stranger should come to town.
Okay, so all in favor of the newcomer? Yeah? Okay, lots of newcomers. Okay, so this says we are bringing the progress level up. So we're now at progress 2. We are putting the trust level to 4 or 5. So I'll put it to 4. I may be slightly misinterpreting some people's handwriting, but we're doing our best here. And the player's wealth goes up. It doesn't say how much, but let's say the player's wealth has gone up to 75. Okay, so current situation. Progress is at 2. Fire is at 1. Player's wealth is 75. Trust is 4. Who can fire?
So I've got somebody wins a game.
Okay.
And I've also got, and somebody realizes they have the wrong ticket. They shouldn't be here.
Okay. Somebody wins. Somebody has the wrong ticket. What else?
You play a hand of poker.
You play a hand of poker. Okay. Yeah?
Player wins a hand by bluffing.
Player wins by bluffing. Okay. Yeah?
Cheating?
Cheating. All right. We're getting a nice spectrum of sort of standard poker behaviors. What else? Get caught bluffing. Okay.
Well, I've got your bluffing too.
Okay, so there are actually multiple bluffing catches are included. Okay. Any others?
So I think so. Get drunk.
Get drunk. Okay. All right. So do we want to?
Thank you.
Newcomer leaves the game. Okay. So we've got all of these options. Do we want to get caught bluffing? Do we want to win by bluffing? Do we want to cheat? I think was one of them. What are people's feelings on these? Anything ring out to you as what you want to do? You want to get caught? Who else wants to get caught? That seems like that moves the story on. Okay, what happens if we get caught?
Trust goes down.
Who had, well, but somebody's got the actual card for this, right?
Trust goes down is the one I've got.
Okay, does it say how much?
Nope.
Okay. Does it move progress forward?
No.
I think I'm going to arbitrarily say that it should.
Okay.
Just because if not, then we're going to be here a while. Okay. All right, so progress has moved forward. Game is partway through. Fire still has not actually really started. All right, so tournament progress is at 3, fire progress is at 1, player's wealth is at 75, trust is at 3. Yeah?
I can fire.
Okay, what is it?
Players break for tacos.
Okay. Players go for tacos, yeah?
Gamblers Anonymous recognize each other.
Okay.
The love triangle.
Love triangle?
I still have somebody wins a game.
Somebody can still win a game.
Still get drunk.
Can still get drunk. There's lots of opportunities for those, apparently.
Fire can still start.
Can still cheat.
Fire can still start.
Do I hear a fire? Does anybody want to start a fire? Yeah, okay. I think it might be time to start a fire. Okay, so what happens when we start a fire?
The fire progresses. It gets hotter.
Okay.
And something here about the player who starts the fire tries to cover it up.
Okay. I mean, that's an interesting narrative beat. Does it say anything about trust, or is that just a descriptive effect?
Just descriptive.
Okay.
Yeah, importantly, I have we start the fire, but that can only happen if our wealth is so low that we have motive to start the
Oh.
fire. And that has the additional effect of lowering the trust.
Interesting.
Well,
Okay.
The bad beat.
You've got the bad beat?
Yeah, lose some wealth.
It could be a cause. Okay. So we're now at progress is 4, fire progress is 2. We've got 75 player wealth, and we've got trust 3. Yep. Wasn't there somebody over there? No?
People can still recognize each other.
People can, Gamblers Anonymous, okay, yeah.
Drive by Belfort.
What?
Extinguisher.
Something with a fire extinguisher?
Yeah, drive by Belfort with extinguisher.
Oh, okay, so Bellhop can come by and eliminate the dramatic tension immediately. Okay.
You can bet the fire extinguisher.
Okay. Bet the extinguisher.
Still get drunk.
Can still get drunk.
Still play hand poker.
Yeah.
Cheat.
Still cheat.
Still win.
Yeah.
Someone recounts an old war story.
Oh, okay, so we've been at the poker table for a while, and it's getting into the deep cuts of our personal background. Okay, so what of that do we like?
I want the war story.
Yeah.
War story. Okay. So this is bringing out naturalistically an interesting thing about this kind of system, which is that players, when they get used to how the system works, they can recognize the plain sort of ordinary mechanical beats from the things that look like they're a narrative lead. And we can get drunk, we can cheat, we can bluff anytime, but we cannot hear a war story anytime. So let's hear the war story.
Fire progress
Possibly I should have let people who wrote them do their own, but it seems fun. Okay, so higher progress is what?
fire progress +1.
Okay.
I think it's random actually, but
Okay, so fire progress is, it's random?
the fire progress.
Yeah, does it say it's random?
It's random between 0 and 3, I think.
Okay, well let's actually make it progress more, because that's more exciting, right? Okay, and what else happens?
Game progress +2.
Oh, whoa, hello. Our mechanics are not prepared for that one. All right, anything else?
The trust is actually dependent on a number of different dialogue responses.
Nice, okay, what are our options?
We've got implies that they are dangerous.
Okay,
-2 trust.
okay.
Implies that they're compassionate +1 trust. Or implies that they're dishonest -1 trust.
Right, okay, do we think they're compassionate, dangerous, or dishonest?
What's the story?
Not there.
They're dangerous.
All right, they're dangerous.
Wow.
Okay. Was that -2?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we have.
All right. So here we have reached the end of the tournament. Now, we've kind of fallen off the end of the story, and the place is on fire, and nobody trusts each other. So basically, that suggests a fairly tragic end, and we could write a story like representing the endings that could adhere here. Oh yeah.
People attempt to escape, but find fire exit blocked, and if trust is 1 or 2, players don't believe this.
Oh, all right. Well, very well done. Nice work. Okay. So obviously there are a lot of things about this that we might refine, right? But you can see how you can start to get these interesting kind of plays of cause and effect between contributions that were actually made by different people. You all knew what you were dealing with, but you were working with different things. There is a lot of convoluted content here, which I am going to skip on over. You can read it on my blog sometime if that's what you want to do, and get to the thing that actually answers a question that somebody had earlier, and then we will stop. So, the next question was, if we're building things out this way, we spend a bunch of time doing some paper prototyping like this, thinking about what kinds of structures we want to do. There's a lot more that we can do structurally if we want to get fancy, so we can have things where we can only make progress if we pay for it by experiencing certain bad effects. There's lots of that kind of interesting trade-off stuff we can do for the player. But we're going to kind of refine all of that. And then at some point, we're going to get to a point where we've actually got kind of different mental structures for different kinds of things that can go into different structures of storylet sequences, right? So you might have some storylet sequences we saw earlier that were quite linear. You might have some, I just show you this for a moment, you might have some storylet sequences where we're actually working within some kind of representation of what is the hand of poker actually like. We've got a whole bunch of storylets just about playing the hand of poker and how it's going to work out that we have to get through. And that's a different kind of play experience, right? If you've got something that's a very linear progress from one storylet to the next, it feels fairly rapid, it feels directive, it feels highly narrative. If you've got something that's more tightly simulating what's going on in gameplay, then that's going to feel more free, it's going to feel more exploratory and open-ended, it's going to feel more simulation and game-like. So you've got these different kinds of things that you can create, and then the question is, how do I mentally organize all of that into a structure that is going to provide a narratively satisfying experience if I'm building out a big game like this? So what I typically tend to do at this point is start to think about what are the sort of macro structures that I'm working up with, and how do those feed into each other? So I might, for instance, have a story where it's kind of a Bond villain style confrontation. I'm going to find out about this villain. I'm going to travel to where the villain is located. I'm going to confront him. There's going to be some kind of aftermath. When all of that happens, some of the pieces of the story I might actually have to pay some kind of cost into in order to make them happen. Maybe I need to have some prior inventory. Maybe I need a bunch of spy gear if I want to do the learning about the villain process. But this might be my initial draft of this. Now, there are a number of issues with this initial draft. One is that I've got these sort of convoluted things where I'm doing these wheels of learning about the villain, traveling to the villain. That's probably going to take me some time experientially in gameplay. Confrontation scene might be a single beat here, and that doesn't really give it the weight that it deserves. In addition, in this example, I'm imagining the pieces here that are purple colored are pieces where I'm relying on either some external game interface, so it might be something where there's map travel, or it might be something where there's a standard element of a storylet-based game that I'm tapping into to use. So what I've got in this story is something where the player is spending a long time doing relatively low-stakes things, and then a very short amount of time doing something interesting, and that doesn't feel quite right yet. So I might change this up in a couple of different ways. I need to make that confrontation scene better. I need to make it take longer. I need to make it more interesting. So what I might do is, instead of having a single storylet beat there, I might have a confrontation scene with escalating risk. So escalating risk here actually corresponds really well to what's going on if I'm still sitting in my chair playing this hand of poker, although the fire is getting hotter and hotter, right? I'm choosing to continue to do something that's dangerous and possibly stupid because I've got something I'm trying to accomplish. Meanwhile, things are getting riskier and riskier. So I might have a confrontation scene that's made of several storylets where the longer it draws out, the more risk I'm at. And then I might actually have that set up so that the player actually can go too far. They can get in trouble. They can wind up, dangling over the shark tank, and then the villain inexplicably walks away, right? So I also need to have a little bit of storylet content to cover getting out of that situation. I also might want to insert a beat between those two big kind of wheels of interaction. So another moment where we're getting ready to do this thing, we're preparing, maybe we're spending some inventory items to gear up, and that might be something where we're actually deciding as a player how much do we want to spend to get into this situation. So that's kind of tying together the narrative stakes and the mechanical stakes in that moment, but it also means that we've got some variety in what the player is experiencing between those pieces, and we don't have one sort of storylet montage followed by another storylet montage, and they all kind of blur together, so we want to make sure that happens. And then the final issue is here, if I've got a cost element in that endgame piece, what's going to happen here is the player's playing through, they've defeated the Bond villain, they're going through their epilogue, it's supposed to be their victory lap, and I'm asking them to pay some kind of price they might have to go somewhere else in the game to get, and that's going to interrupt the flow, so I need to take that out. So those kinds of things, this is sort of very kind of rapid fire way of thinking about this, but I often do a fair amount of kind of design planning of this kind where it's not necessarily even tied to what's in the data. I'm just planning out what it's going to look like, and that allows me to structure things. So more pacing rules you can do with this elsewhere. Once you've got that kind of structure in mind, you know what your stats are, you know the kinds of major beats you want, you know the general structure, that's when you write. Put some content in there. my use of the word obviously. Sometimes, I mean, production schedules exist, and sometimes we don't get to iterate on things as much as we would like. But this kind of system benefits very strongly from giving you a chance to play through and discover things that might be wrong with it. So does the player know at all times where to go to look for the next thing? It really depends what your game UI is like, but depending on what that kind of experience is, it might or might not be obvious where the next piece of their storyline is to be found. So that's something you want to make sure is always present. If there are parts of the state space that are not well covered, that's something we might want to look at. In the example storylets that we had in this process, we had only a couple of storylets for the beginning of the game. Now that might be fine, because we might want to have a very controlled experience for the moment when the tournament starts. That might be okay. Or we might actually decide, oh no, we need more there. We might also think, there's actually not that much that was about the player's wealth. We should have been doing more to the wealth. We should have been basing more on where the wealth was. So as we're kind of experiencing that, we might think about, do we want to add some elements to kind of balance this out? And also, where are there storylets where that particular storylet is going to do the same thing to your stats over and over? Because that's a place where it's easy to make your gameplay unbalanced if you've kind of approached writing it from the point of view of the player is going to do each of these things once, they might not. Okay, so that was a very sort of rapid bit, but since there was a question earlier, I wanted to at least cover it. And you have 4 minutes to ask me any questions you may have. Yes?
So in those last few diagrams, what was cost?
Cost was inventory that the player might have achieved by actions elsewhere in the game. So, I mean, in Fallen London terms, it would be exactly that, like so many silk scraps or whatever.
Yeah, so it's like prerequisites.
Yeah, it's part of the prerequisites, but it's something you're going to trade this in to accomplish that being unlocked. Yeah?
You talked before about kind of modeling the state of knowledge between different characters.
Yeah.
Do you do that with a similar kind of point system, or is that a different?
So typically I do that with, oh God. I mean, there are a lot of ways to do that. What I wind up coming back to most often is for any given story, there are usually a relatively small number of pieces of information that are narratively determining for that story. And so what I will do is make each of those things a flag or a binary, or it's a 0 or 1 or something like that. Or it might be, occasionally there's something where it's actually worth having it be integers, because it's like, I have a sequence of 4 pieces of evidence that I'm going to uncover in order to learn something, right? And I have done lots and lots of other things. So sometimes I've done things where there's an abstraction that sort of represents the general amount of knowledge you have about a situation. That tends to be too fuzzy to be useful in practice. I've done things that are much more detail, like predicate logic, like we're really modeling exactly what they think, but you wind up, at least in the kinds of things that I'm writing, I have found that it's very rare that you go down that level of modeling and wind up with a narrative game at the end. Like, you get a really interesting toy that maybe is a little philosophically cool, but it's a different thing. Yeah?
A follow-on question.
Yeah.
I guess if you're writing the start of something that you're wanting to then have other people contribute to,
Yes.
there are potentially certain things like I've met Bob, or I've met
Yes.
or whatever, that once you've played through, that moment is gone.
Yeah.
Which could be captured as knowledge,
Yep.
or could be just something you're going to work in later if it's important. How have you found that with the pieces you worked on in terms of like retrofitting that to something that's already in existence?
Right. So it's useful to be able to go in and look at, somebody. So let me make sure I'm understanding exactly the scenario you're describing well enough. So the deal is there is a pre-existing piece of content with storylets that have, this storylet introduces the character of Bob, right? And then another writer is going to come along and do something with that story and the fact that you've met Bob. Right. So that, like if you arrive on the scene and a previous writer has created these storylit beats and they've got a storylit that narrates that you've met Bob, but there's no effect on the story to keep track of that. That's tricky. It's hard to use that then. It's hard to use your knowledge of Bob. But what I find effective a lot of the time is you've kind of built your understanding of what is in the world model to start with. Like, so in this story, it's the kind of story where we're going to want to track all we've met, and that's just going to be a rule that we're going to apply from the beginning of how this happens, or from the beginning is optimistic. At some point during the design, hopefully in the early stages, we will realize we've written some content that's not adequately marked up. We will have a frenzy and spend a lot of time correctly applying the effects, and then we will go forward, and then we will rap on the knuckles anybody who doesn't do it right after that. That's how it actually happens. Yeah.
So, aside from the assumption that every storylet is seen once, which you might implicitly make, another one is that any valid storylet that you meet the prerequisites for is equally likely to be chosen. Can you speak to
Right.
That's not always the case.
that is definitely not always the case. So there are a number of interesting things you can do to tweak that. So there are some systems, like the RAIN system, for instance, has probabilistic weighting on it that makes some things less likely to turn up than others. So that means, I'm drawing from this pool of cards. Maybe this is a rare event. It meets all the prerequisites, but it just doesn't luck into being chosen right now. Another approach is to have a salience-based system where it's actually scoring the storylets depending on how many prerequisites they meet. So if it's like, okay, this storylet is written for the specific situation where trust is exactly 4 and the player has exactly 92 chips and the fire is raging or whatever, well, clearly, that is incredibly particular to the moment that we're in, and therefore we should fire it off if we can. And so you can score storylets that way. That gets a little bit more advanced, but it can be done. Does that cover what you...
Yeah, that's exactly what.
Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to ask where you stood on kind of the approach behind showing or hiding these kind of variables from the reader or player.
Yeah. It depends. There are some really interesting things you can get out of making your mechanics explicit, especially if you're building a system where you really want the system that you've built to be part of the storytelling. So you really want your players to understand, hey, you know what, if you say things like that, people are going to trust you less. Sometimes you want to expose that mechanic because you want them to be conscious of those things, and it's part of the message of your story. And then other times, you don't want people to metagame, you don't want them to revert to a save because they saw they just did something disadvantageous. So it really it's worth thinking about that from the perspective of what is knowing this going to do to the player's experience of the underlying structure, and to what extent is the underlying structure even part of what they're supposed to be reading. If you really want to create something where it feels very naturalistic and very sort of, it's just a flowing experience that just continues in interesting ways, but you don't have to work out why, the player is probably going to have less of a sense of agency in that context, but more of a sense of naturalism. So you're kind of, what matters most there? Yeah.
Possibly a pub question, but have you tried or have you had any success measuring the players' choices rather than the character choices? So, this player is always picking happier options, sadder options.
So we're tracking a sense of player. So we're doing some player modeling, is what you're suggesting, and trying to work out their motivation. One certainly could think about that. I don't think I have not been on a project where I had access to the player data where the data set was large enough and I had enough access to it to meaningfully analyze that. And it also probably wouldn't be my first concern. Players sometimes will self-identify about that stuff, but that's kind of a different line. And I mean, I've definitely been on things where you can see kind of aggregations of there seem to be certain types of players who really enjoy pushing their luck, or certain types of players who really are always going to go for, you know, if there's a hint of a romance, they're often down the road. Like you can find categories of that kind of stuff. But okay, thank you all for coming. Thank you all for putting up with my shenanigans and participating in the wacky games. I hope we'll see you all again at a future event.